My name's Darrel Morrison. I have been working with landscapes since about 1960. My specialty, I would say, is what I like to call ecological landscape design, where ecological processes inform the design. As a result, I became really interested in the tall grass prairie when I was in the Midwest and learned some techniques for restoration of grasslands. Subsequently, I've worked in a variety of different habitats, again with the goal of capturing the essence of those native landscapes, not copying them per se, but again trying to capture the main elements, the visual elements, and in the case of the prairie, the movement of the prairie and how that dynamic works. I guess my strength would be working with native vegetation, native plant communities, and some people have asked me, would you ever plant a non-native plant? And I say, yes, I love tomato and basil, so I will plant non-native plants. But in the design landscape, I focus very much on things that are native to the region where I'm working. Certainly in landscape design, having a variety of species and hence a variety of colors and textures with a variety of blooming times just makes it a whole lot more interesting. Which leads me actually to something that I learned from the Kaplans at the University of Michigan, environmental psychologists who talk about the 4 characteristics of naturally evolving landscapes that seem to really engage people. And one of them is complexity. And so complexity does come with diversity of species. The other 3 were mystery, the idea of not being able to see everything at once. And that's at play here, too, because you really can see this room, and then you have to move, and you see another landscape room, so you don't see everything at once. And then there's coherence. While there's a lot of potentially diversity, and hence diversity of colors and textures, there's also pattern, and that's something that I have been able to work with here a lot, creating patterns with the vegetation that we put in. And then the 4th characteristic that the Kaplans talk about as being desirable is the one of legibility, being able to read how you'll move through the place and not feel claustrophobic or confused. In the end, I think the most critical thing is knowing the landscape in the region where you're working, and the living landscape that we haven't tampered with too much is certainly a great source of inspiration. The whole idea of plant communities growing as a group of species that associate naturally, and that was something I really learned from a 1929 book by Edith Roberts, an ecologist, and Elsa Raymond, a landscape architect, called American Plants for American Gardens, where they really discussed communities of plants, not just collections of native plants, but communities of plants that grow together. And my theory is that if plants grow together naturally, they will fit together very well in a designed landscape as well. One thing I did on one occasion is sleeping on a site for a night before doing any design work there, so that I could really get the feel of it as the sun went down, as the sun came up, and hear the sounds. And I think that's a good way to begin. Some painters really inspire me a lot. I'm a big fan of Kandinsky because of the energy in his paintings. They don't look like landscapes, but they're so full of energy and life. Van Gogh's paintings with those brush strokes and the movement again. Movement is key, I think. And of course, in the landscape, we have the potential for physical movement as well as a form that appears to move. I have often used music in teaching, and again at that early stage of a design where you're doing the mass space development, having the right music to get you moving, and then using chalk pastels, for example, so you don't get real tight, you have to stay loose. The right music can give you form, and different types of music would lead to different forms for different types of designs. One of the key individuals in my own evolution was Jens Jensen, Danish-born landscape architect who came to this country in the late 1880s and began working in the Chicago park system. His basic skill that I was so impressed with initially was his management of mass and space and light and shadow, and thinking about the experience of moving from from shaded areas out into the sunlight. Also, Jensen, after learning the native vegetation around Chicago, began increasingly using native plants. Another person whose work influenced me quite a lot was Roberto Burle Marx in Brazil. And one of his strengths was the forms that he created, the forms of water bodies. But he, in terms of planting, he said, I paint with plants. So he would do painterly designs with plants. Another one was A.E. Bye, B-Y-E, in Connecticut. And he talked about the value of placing translucent vegetation like ferns and grasses and certain and aspens, for example, between the observer and the sunlight. And so when those plants are backlit, they glow, and you get luminosity into your designs. I first visited here probably 7 years ago now, and I came up just as a visitor. It was basically pretty typical suburban landscape, lots of lawn and not much wild growing. It does have the surrounding white pines, which are native trees. But what really impressed me about the site was the topography and the big bowl-like space out here and the potential for having big rooms here, so to speak, that are sort of subdivisions of the property. I don't think I had any preconceptions initially about what would be planted here, but I knew the fact that there are uplands and lowlands, pond and steep slopes, that we could have a lot of diversity, which is something I really value, because there would be plants that matched up with each of those environments. In the landscape that we're sitting in this minute, certainly I knew that it was not extremely well drained, and I knew that the yellow flower ragwort is one that thrives on that condition and will reproduce, and also the blue one, the Jacob's ladder, and then the woods phlox, which is pretty adaptable to various levels of moisture and light. So you start to put that all together once you know the microenvironment that you're dealing with, and then that fits into the bigger picture of mass, space, plant community designations. Interestingly, gray birches are a pioneer species that comes in early at the edges of woods, and I've seen them all the way from dry ridges to the edges of ponds, so they have a great tolerance for a variety of moisture, which makes them very useful in design situations. Really a beautiful example of a naturally occurring drift of vegetation is one right here on the site, where there's this beautiful fern drift in a wet area, sensitive ferns and associated species, that sort of is the quintessential drift, in my opinion, of the way plants occur naturally. And there is pattern, and it's not random and chaotic, but there is clear pattern, which I really, really value. I use different colored flags to represent different plant species, and having these vividly colored flags, you can see the patterns, you can see drift-like movement of plants, and the drift is a big thing in my design, where there is sort of a linear movement, directional movement of a plant species through the landscape, and then it may intermingle with another species that takes over, but it's a very fluid movement, and oftentimes that's related to slight changes in moisture and soil. So the drift is a big deal. Maybe in part because I grew up in the Midwest and had all that sky and all that wind and all those things associated with prairies. I have a real affinity with them. But then when I learned about prairies at the University of Wisconsin by seeing restored prairies at the Arboretum, then I became really intrigued by them. The species diversity, 9 species in a square meter, for example, and the deep roots of the plants being able to capture water from 5, 7, 12 feet down. Just wonderful plants, but then the aesthetics of them equally is really powerful. So the prairie is just a very strong symbol of life and history. I would say in any landscape design that I do now, certainly, I have 4 concurrent goals. One is that it be ecologically sound, meaning plants are put in the right place and they don't require large amounts of energy and external inputs. They certainly don't include invasive species that will escape into and diminish the natural diversity. So ecological soundness is key. But equally important is experiential richness, so that people have this great experience of a landscape that is moving and colorful and exciting. And then another important one is being of the place, so that we know where we are when we are in a designed landscape, because increasingly designed landscapes all look alike, it seems, or they have in the past, whereas the natural landscape varies with the region, with the microenvironment, so there's lots more variation. And then the fourth characteristic is that the landscape is dynamic. Dynamic meaning that it changes over time, and it changes from May to July to September to November. That's one level, but it also changes over longer periods of time, so that the landscape you see in 2017 is not the same one you will see in 2027. There will be change any way you look at it. There's this really exciting move toward restoring diversity, and while it's really exciting to do it on 29-acre site, you can do it at home too. You can have just a sample of that. You can't certainly replicate the horizon-to-horizon grassland, but you can have diversity and on the site where we're sitting. I think if the homeowner wants to move in the direction that we've been talking, where you have more biotic diversity and more ecologically sound landscape, you could sort of approach it incrementally. And a first step might be, when doing new planting, trees and shrubs, to plant native species, to introduce species from other places, which will begin to get it localized a bit. Second step, which I think is really important, is diversification. Instead of having a solid cover of Vinca minor or Pachysandra, you put in a mix of 10, 15 species of ferns and wildflowers, woodland wildflowers in the shade, prairie things in the sun. So you get diversity even in a border or in a small area. Try to capture the essence in a small way of a native plant community, and you could do it in a third of an acre or less. And then finally, the next step is to really try to restore the natural diversity that might have been there before, which requires a lot more depth and a lot more digging into what the natural species composition would be. But you can start simply by using native species that don't probably require irrigation, that probably are much more able to handle climatic extremes, and then diversifying. If there were sort of a central message that I would give to students, and I do, is that you need to spend time in the landscape. The landscape is our medium, and landscape architecture students spend hundreds of hours in front of a computer screen these days, and precious few hours in the landscape. And again, the landscape is what we work with, and the more we understand the dynamics and the change and the beauty of that, the better. One of the things that makes landscape design so exciting is that it's always a work in progress. You don't finish it and then walk away. You get it started, and then you observe, you tweak it, and you modify it if need be, add more plants to get more diversity, as we've been doing here, but it's never finished. I think if there's anything any message I would like to leave, is that it is really our responsibility to protect the species that were here before we were. And we've done a very good job of diminishing that diversity, a very bad job, you might say, over these last couple hundred years, where we've taken really diverse systems and oversimplified them, made them dysfunctional, and have spent all kinds of resources on chemicals and fertilizers that in the end are negative. Most important thing I can leave with students is to spend time in the landscape that is our teacher, should be our teacher.